This is our class discussion of the data for the Coral Snapshots lab. And I just wanted to show you this map because it shows the area of Bonaire and where these reefs that we're studying come from. So this shows you the location. The Thousand Steps reef is right here, which is where the pictures that we analyzed for this lab actually came from. So let's scroll down. I just want to show you the key that was used. Again, this was the key that was used to identify the different things that we observed in the coral pictures, the coral reef pictures. This would be sand here, octocorals, also known as soft corals. Any rocks that had sediment on them, they would be considered rubble. Then, of course, we have fish. This is old coral with algae growing on top of it. And this is what a healthy stony coral looks like. You can see a nice greenish brown color. But there's also another type of stony coral that was commonly found here, and that's what is underneath this fish over here. That is the stony coral called brain coral. And then finally, if there was something that you couldn't see because of a shadow, it was considered to be undeterminable. So we just listed that as a shadow. This was the first picture. This is a picture taken from the shallow reef. And in class, students were to go ahead and identify what was below each of the yellow triangles. So up here we have sand, and over here there's rubble. Here's some nice healthy stony corals, octocorals in the middle, more stony corals down here on the lower right hand corner, and then over here we have a bunch of coral that is old, and some of it has since died. You can see it's blotchy and is covered with sediment. May even be some occurrences of bleaching there, so that's definitely old dead coral. This next picture right here, this is a picture from the deep reef. So this is about 10 to 20 meters deeper than the previous picture. You might see some differences in light attenuation there. But the prominent thing that we notice here, a lot more fish. Here's a nice brain coral right here in the middle. We've got some stony corals down here as well. But we also have a lot more dead coral and rubble and less sand in this area, and a lot more undeterminable area as far as shadows are concerned. So again, that would make more sense. There's kind of less light down here, so it's hard to tell with some of these triangles what they're pointing to. All right, well, let's talk about some typical results you would get from this lab here, and that's what we see here. If you were to total up for the shallow reef site, that's again, this is table 2, shallow reef site, we would find 14 stony corals, 15 octocorals, 0 fish, 8 dead corals, and 16 of the triangles were on sand or rubble. Now, to calculate the Shannon Biodiversity Index, you would take column C and divide by column N to get this number. And then you take the natural log of column D to get the number in column E. And then you multiply column D and E together to get column F. So I did the first one as an example for you, but I'd like you guys to do the rest. And just so you know that you make your calculations correct, your Shannon Biodiversity Index, or H, should come out to equal 1.296. And that's for the shallow reef. Now when we go to the deep reef site, the second part of table 2, we can see that we've got 11 stony corals, only 1 octocoral, 6 fish, 11 dead corals, and 12 sand and rubble. So again, you would do the same procedure that you did in the first part of the table, and just to make sure you're getting the right calculation, the Shannon index for the deep reef came out to be 1.69, so that had a higher diversity in the lower area. All right, well, let's talk about our discussion questions. Your conclusion, explain why your hypothesis was either supported. And that depended on what you wrote as your hypothesis. If you had predicted that the biodiversity would change then that is supported because the biodiversity figures for the shallow and deep reef were different. And that leads into the first discussion question: how does biodiversity compare between the shallow reef and the deep reef? Well, shallow reef had a lower biodiversity index. So that's the key there. So diversity, whoops, let's spell that correctly, huh? Diversity was higher in deeper reef. Well, number 2 now asks this question: what may be the reason for any difference in biodiversity between shallow and deep reef locations? There's actually a few reasons why this might be. The first one, if we think about depth, and one of the things that we learned about, and I kind of mentioned it as we were looking at those pictures, the first one is the amount of, again, spelling Mr. Yash, amount of light. So the amount of light is different, but there's a few other things. There could be differences in nutrient levels. Nutrient levels may accumulate more in the deeper reef as compared, or in the shallow reef actually, and also the amount of sediment accumulation may affect the biodiversity, and sediments may tend to accumulate in the shallow reef, which would explain why it's not quite as diverse in the shallow reef. So now number 3, which site had a greater abundance of coral and why? Well, to do that, you would look at your stony, and it's asking for abundance of coral. So we're going to look at the 2 corals, stony and octocorals, okay? And if we would have to look at the relative abundance. That's the key here. So we'd have to go ahead and take, we want to calculate the abundance. We got the abundance here of the stony corals, but we need the abundance here for the octocorals. And we can do that. Take out our calculator, and let's do 5 divided by the total 43. That was big N. And that gives us a relative abundance of 0.116. So 0.116. Well, we want to do the same thing for down here. 11 divided by 41 gives us 0.268. 0.268. And then for the octocorals, same thing. 1 divided by 41 gives us 0.024. Now, if we were to add up those 2 numbers for each one, we see that up here in the shallow reef, there is a greater abundance of corals. So the point there is shallow reef had greater coral abundance. In other words, there was more coral there. The reasons for that, pardon the announcement. Now, which site had a greater abundance of dead coral, you'd have to do the same thing. And I believe we find that in the deeper reef, there was a greater abundance. So there was more dead coral in deep reef, likely because of less light and perhaps sedimentation. In other words, sediments accumulating on the coral heads and killing them. So that ends our discussion here for this particular lab. And you can always come to me if you have any particular questions on it.